Picture this. You're standing in your mother's kitchen on Christmas Eve. Flour on your hands, apron tied around your waist, 25 guests laughing in the living room just beyond the doorway. Your mother walks in, looks at the cold stove, looks at you, and asks, with that particular tone she is always reserved for disappointing things, "Why you haven't started cooking yet?" That was me. December 23rd, 2024. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't tell her that 3 hours earlier I'd been sitting in a corner office reviewing a contract worth more money than her husband's company earned in a year. I didn't mention the 23 people who reported to me, or the Fortune 500 clients whose events I managed, or the Forbes feature that had been sitting in my bag for 2 months because I already knew exactly how she would respond to it. Instead, I did something I had never done before in 37 years of being my family's invisible workhorse. I untied the apron, set it on the counter, and booked a one-way flight to Miami. I left behind an empty kitchen and a Christmas dinner that would never be cooked, and I flew toward the most important meeting of my career. A meeting my family didn't know existed because they had never once asked what I actually did for a living. My name is Claire Hartwell. I'm 37 years old. I founded an event planning firm called Apex Events 12 years ago from a laptop on my kitchen table, and last year we generated $4.2 million in revenue. I have 23 employees, a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Denver skyline, and a client list that includes companies most people recognize from television commercials. My family thought I organized birthday parties for children. This is the story of how they found out the truth, and how they found out because I finally stopped being afraid to let them. To understand what I did on December 23rd, you need to understand what that moment actually felt like from the inside. It wasn't a single dramatic decision that arrived fully formed. It was more like the last inch of a thread finally giving way after 15 years of tension. I had been the family's invisible worker for so long that I had developed a kind of automatic compliance. I showed up, I cooked, I cleaned, I smiled through it, and I drove home alone to a life they didn't know existed. Every holiday, the same choreography, the same apron, the same kitchen, the same sequence of being handed a task while everyone else settled into the living room. What I hadn't fully reckoned with until that December afternoon was the contrast between those two versions of my life. The version my family saw, Claire, who had time for cooking because she didn't have a real job. The version that existed in reality, Claire, who managed 23 employees, negotiated contracts with corporate executives, and had been featured in a national business publication 3 months earlier. Both versions were real. Both happened in the same body, the same city, the same 37 years. But my family only ever saw one of them, and they saw it because I had let them. I had kept the other version completely separate, partly from exhaustion and partly from a kind of protective resignation. The last time I had tried to share something about my work, my mother had responded with a question about dry cleaning. After that, I stopped trying. The apron, that December day, was the moment I understood something clearly for the first time. I had been choosing their version of me over my own. Every time I tied that apron, I was agreeing that I was the cook and not the CEO, agreeing that family came first in the specific way my mother defined it, which meant her comfort first and mine whenever there was anything left over. There was never anything left over. I set the apron on the counter, picked up my phone, booked the flight, and felt, on the drive home to pack my bag, something I hadn't felt in a kitchen in 15 years, like myself. Before I go any further, if you're here, thank you. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and it genuinely means the world to me. The pattern started 15 years ago, at Christmas 2009. I was 22, fresh out of college with a communications degree and no job offers. The economy had collapsed, My resumes were disappearing into a void, and I was living in my childhood bedroom in Denver, drafting cover letters that nobody answered. My mother, Patricia, announced, rather than asked, that I would be handling Christmas dinner for 15 guests. My sister Megan, 18 and a freshman at college, was apparently too busy with finals to help, though she spent most of that weekend on the couch scrolling through her phone, which was a very particular kind of busy. When I pointed out that I had job applications to finish, my mother deployed the phrase she would use on me hundreds of times over the following decade. This is family, and family comes first. I spent 2 days in that kitchen: turkey, mashed potatoes from scratch, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls, 2 pies, a polished silverware setting, and a centerpiece I arranged myself. When the guests arrived on Christmas Eve, I was still wearing the gravy-stained apron while my father stood in the living room with a glass of scotch, introducing Megan to his business partner as the daughter who was going to take over the company someday. He glanced at me as I walked past with a platter of appetizers and turned back without a word. That was the first sign. Megan was the future. I was furniture. When one of the guests complimented the stuffed mushrooms and asked who made them, my mother said, "That's just Claire. She has time for cooking. No job yet." The sympathy look I received from that guest is one I have never entirely forgotten. The pattern repeated at every gathering after that. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, anniversary dinners, birthdays. I was always in the kitchen or setting up or cleaning afterward. Megan was always at the table, being showcased, being introduced, being celebrated. By 2012, I had started Apex events. I was good at coordinating logistics, managing vendors, creating experiences, skills I had developed, with no small irony in my parents' kitchen. When I mentioned it to my mother, she barely looked up from her magazine. She called it nice, the way you call a child's drawing nice, and asked me to pick up her dry cleaning on the way home. She never asked about it again. Neither did my father, neither did Megan, so I stopped offering. For 12 years, I built Apex events in complete silence around my family. My first major client in 2014 paid $8,000 for a tech startup launch party. By 2018, I had 5 employees and an office downtown. By 2022, I was managing events for Fortune 500 companies. When I visited my parents, I drove my old Honda instead of my Audi. I wore jeans and plain sweaters. I never mentioned the 23 people on my payroll or what the company earned. Why? Because they never asked. And I was exhausted by the experience of offering information that would be used to minimize me. Last Thanksgiving, November 2024, was when something in me finally cracked open. I had just closed a $600,000 deal with a major hotel chain. I walked into my parents' house on the crest of genuine professional pride, and my mother handed me an apron and a turkey basting schedule she had printed out. 23 people reported to me. I had been profiled in 3 industry publications. I had negotiated contracts with CEOs who ran companies worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and my mother handed me a basting schedule. I took the apron. I basted the turkey. I served dinner to 18 people while Megan held court about the stress of her job as marketing director at our father's company, a position she had been handed, not earned. My father praised her numbers. I could have mentioned that my company's revenue had grown 31% that year. There was no point. They would have found a way to make it small. After dinner, elbow deep in dishwater, I made a decision. This would be my last holiday as the family servant. I didn't know yet what I would do differently. I just knew that 15 years was enough. I hung up the apron, drove home to an apartment my family had never once visited because they had never thought to ask where I lived, and I went to bed. 2 weeks later, everything changed. But before I get there, I want to tell you something about what those 15 years actually looked like. Not in the big moments, but in the accumulation of small ones. Because that's where the damage actually happens. Not in one catastrophic event, but in the steady, quiet repetition of being treated as less than. Every family gathering, I arrived early and left late. I knew the hosting rituals better than anyone. Which serving bowls went with which dishes, where the extra napkins were kept, how long the oven took to preheat, which relatives were on dietary restrictions, and which ones claimed to be when they actually just didn't like certain vegetables. I knew these things because I had been doing them since I was 22, and nobody had ever once suggested I stop. My father would greet guests at the door and guide them to the living room where Megan would be waiting, poised, well-rested, wearing something that had not been chosen to withstand gravy splatter. She would charm them. She would laugh at the right moments. She would accept compliments about her work with the comfortable ease of someone who had been told she was impressive for so long that she had stopped noticing people saying it. I would walk past them with platters. By 2016, Apex Events had landed its first corporate gala contract. 280 guests, a downtown Denver hotel, a budget that made my earlier work look like rehearsal. I remember sitting in my car in my parents' driveway that Thanksgiving, having just closed the deal that morning, and thinking, should I tell them? I ran through the likely responses. My mother would find a reason it wasn't as significant as it sounded. My father would compare it to something Megan had done. The conversation would end with me feeling smaller than when I started it. I went inside. I put on the apron. That became the pattern. My professional life growing steadily larger, while my family life kept me exactly the size they had decided I was at 22. And here's the thing about being kept small by the people you love. You start to maintain it yourself. You start driving the old car to their house. You start downplaying the client names when they accidentally come up. You start answering the question, what are you up to these days, with a shrug and a vague reference to event work, because the full answer requires too much explanation, and the explanation will be dismissed anyway. I was protecting myself from their dismissal by offering them nothing to dismiss. The cost was that I had no one in my family who knew who I actually was. December 22nd, 2024. I was in my corner office watching snow drift past the floor-to-ceiling windows when my CFO and closest friend, Daniel Torres, knocked on the glass and slid his tablet across my desk without a word. Daniel had been with me since 2015, when Apex was just me and a spreadsheet. He had watched me build something real while my family dismissed it as a hobby. He had the particular calm of someone who had survived enough crises to stop being frightened by them, which made the expression on his face when he handed me the tablet more significant than it might have seemed from another person. On the screen was an email from a woman named Eleanor Vance, CEO of Summit Holdings, a hospitality and real estate conglomerate worth $3.8 billion. The subject line read, Partnership Proposal, Exclusive Event Services, 2025. I read it twice to confirm I wasn't misreading it. Summit Holdings wanted to sign an exclusive contract with Apex Events. Every corporate function, client dinner, product launch, and investor gala for the entire year. They had reviewed our portfolio, spoken to our references, and conducted thorough due diligence. The proposed contract value was $2.1 million. I asked Daniel if it was real. He said he had called their legal team to confirm. It was real, but there was a condition. Eleanor Vance wanted to meet in person before signing. She didn't do business with people she hadn't looked in the eye. The meeting was scheduled for December 24th at 11 in the morning at Summit Holdings headquarters in Miami. I asked if we could reschedule. Daniel explained that Eleanor was flying to Europe on the 26th and wouldn't be back until mid-January. If we didn't sign by Christmas Eve, the contract would go to our biggest competitor, a firm called Premier Affairs that had been chasing our clients for months. I understood the stakes immediately. Summit Holdings wasn't just a contract. They were the kind of client whose endorsement opened doors throughout their entire network. Landing them meant expansion into the Florida market, a national profile instead of a regional one. Losing them to Premier Affairs meant the opposite. Questions about why Summit had passed on us. Momentum shifting. 12 years of reputation work beginning to erode. There was one more detail. Daniel showed me a second email. Eleanor had mentioned in her initial outreach that she had read my Forbes profile, a feature that had run in October, a full-page photograph of me in my office with the Denver skyline behind me. She had called me a quiet force reshaping corporate gatherings. She said she was looking forward to meeting the woman behind Apex events. I had never shown that article to my family. I already knew what my mother would say. Something about the photograph making me look tired, or how my sister's friend had also been in a magazine once, so it wasn't that remarkable. I told Daniel to book the flight, and then, against every rational instinct I possessed, I picked up my phone because I had received a text from my mother marked important. 15 years of conditioning doesn't evaporate overnight. The daughter who still hoped that one day it would be different, she picked up the phone and called. My mother answered immediately and told me that Christmas plans had changed. Megan's friends were joining. 25 guests total. She needed me there early the next morning to cook and decorate because Megan was too busy with work. I told her I couldn't come, that I had a business trip to Miami, that it was important. She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and asked what I was organizing. Some little party? When I told her it was a significant client meeting, she called it my freelance work and said it could wait, that family came first. I told her I couldn't cancel. She asked if I meant couldn't or wouldn't. I said both. What followed was 15 years of everything compressed into 3 minutes. She called me selfish. She listed my failures. 37, unmarried, no real career, wasting years on a hobby while my sister built an actual future. She said that when family needed me, I was never there. I told her I was going to Miami, that she could manage the dinner without me. She told me that if I walked out on the family, I shouldn't bother coming back. I said goodbye and hung up. I sat for a moment looking at the Denver skyline through my office windows. My heart was fast, but my mind was strangely, unusually calm. Daniel appeared in my doorway and asked if I was all right. I told him what had happened, that she had wanted me to cancel the biggest contract opportunity of my career, to cook dinner for 25 people on Christmas Eve, and that when I said no, she had told me not to come back. He sat down across from my desk. He told me that in 9 years of working together, he had watched me negotiate million-dollar contracts and manage crises that would have broken most people. He told me I was one of the most capable executives he had ever known. And then he said, "But when it comes to your family, you become someone smaller. This is the moment. You can keep shrinking yourself to fit their expectations, or you can choose your own path, but not both." My phone buzzed. A text from Megan. Mom was crying. I was selfish. I couldn't prioritize family for even one day. I deleted the thread. I told Daniel to confirm the flight. He nodded and headed for the door, pausing once to look back and tell me I was making the right call. It was worth more than he probably realized. That evening, I went home to my apartment. The 2-bedroom loft in the Lodo neighborhood that cost $3,000 a month, with exposed brick walls and a mountain view that my family had never seen because they had never asked where I lived. I packed a carry-on with professional clothes for the meeting, my laptop, contracts, presentation materials, and one more thing, the October issue of Forbes with my photograph on page 47. I wasn't entirely sure why I packed it. Maybe as proof. Maybe as armor. Maybe just to hold something in my hands that confirmed I wasn't imagining my own life. At 8:45 that night, my plane lifted off from Denver International through snow clouds headed for Miami. Below me, my family was probably sitting in the living room, furious at my absence. Somewhere over Texas, around midnight, I pulled out the Forbes magazine. The article called me a quiet force, described our growth trajectory, our 93% client retention rate, our expansion into sustainable event practices. 3 CEOs were quoted calling me indispensable and the best in the business. My family had no idea it existed. I landed in Miami at 1:30 in the morning, checked into the hotel, and slept for 6 hours. When I woke on December 24th, I had 11 new text messages, 4 from my mother, 3 from Megan, 2 from my father, 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. I didn't read any of them. I showered, dressed in my best charcoal suit, reviewed my notes, and at 10:30 took a car to Summit Holdings headquarters, a glass tower in Brickell that reflected the December sun like a signal. Eleanor Vance was already at the conference room table when I was shown in. She was in her early 50s, silver-haired, with the sharp, assessing eyes of someone who had built something significant from nothing. Her handshake was firm. She mentioned she had a flight to Denver that afternoon. Denver. My stomach tightened slightly. I filed the detail away and focused on the meeting. The signing took 45 minutes. Eleanor was thorough. She reviewed every clause, asked pointed questions about our capacity, our vendor relationships, our contingency protocols. I answered each one with the confidence of someone who had spent 12 years preparing for exactly this kind of conversation. At 11:52 in the morning, we both signed the contract. A photographer captured the moment, the two of us shaking hands, the Miami skyline glittering behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Welcome to the Summit family," Eleanor said warmly. She was already gathering her things for the airport when she paused and mentioned, almost in passing, that she was spending Christmas Eve with some business contacts in Denver. A family named Hartwell. Did I know them? My father ran a construction supply company. My sister worked there. Eleanor explained that she had been invited to their Christmas dinner by my mother and that she was curious about a potential investment opportunity my father had been pitching. She laughed and added that she had been told the food would be spectacular. The food I was supposed to have cooked. I kept my expression completely neutral and told her I hoped she enjoyed the evening. At the door, she paused and said there was something familiar about my name. She asked if I was related to the Denver Hartwells. This was the moment. I could have told her everything, that those were my parents, that Megan was my sister, that I had spent 15 years being their unpaid caterer while building the company she had just signed a $2 million contract with. Instead, I told her it was a common name. She nodded, seemed satisfied, and left. I sat alone in the conference room for a long time after the door closed, the signed contract in my hands. Eleanor Vance had no idea that the spectacular Christmas dinner she was about to attend in Denver had been organized around the expectation that I would cook it. She didn't know that the family she was visiting had spent 15 years dismissing my work as a hobby. She didn't know that the woman she had just called one of the most impressive executives she had encountered was the same woman her hosts had spent decades treating as staff. When she arrived at my parents' house that evening, she would find no dinner, no caterer, no magical spread that had materialized from nowhere. She would find an empty kitchen and a family that had never thought to have a backup plan, because for 15 years, I had always been the backup plan. I flew back to Denver that afternoon. I ordered Thai food, turned off my phone, and spent Christmas Eve alone in my apartment. For the first time in 15 years, it was peaceful. I pieced together what happened at my parents' house that evening from accounts shared with me later by Grace Coleman, a family friend who had been attending Hartwell Christmas dinners for 15 years and who called me on December 26th to apologize. At 5:30 in the afternoon, my mother walked into her kitchen expecting the usual scene. Trays of appetizers, a roasting turkey, burners going on every surface. She found cold appliances and empty counters. No Claire. The next hour was controlled chaos. Phone calls to every catering company in Denver. All booked or closed for the holiday. A desperate grocery store run that found the prepared food section stripped clean. My father calling in favors with 3 restaurants, all of whom declined politely. By 6 o'clock, when guests began arriving, the Hartwell dining table held the following: 2 store-bought rotisserie chickens, 3 bags of pre-mixed salad, a cheese platter from a warehouse store, and dinner rolls still in their plastic packaging. My mother's smile, Grace told me, was the smile of someone holding something together through sheer force of will, which is a specific expression I knew very well from the inside. Eleanor Vance arrived at 7:15. She swept through the living room with the ease of someone accustomed to any room she entered, shook hands with my father, complimented the decorations, made pleasantries with Megan. My mother managed the explanation for the food situation with the phrase, "unexpected challenges," which is, I must admit, technically accurate. Then Grace Coleman, sitting quietly with her phone, stopped scrolling. She had found a LinkedIn post published hours earlier, a photograph. Eleanor Vance shaking hands with a woman in a charcoal suit, Miami skyline behind them. The caption announced a new partnership between Summit Holdings and Apex Events, congratulated its founder, and included a Forbes tag. Grace looked up and said, loudly enough for the nearby cluster of guests to hear, "Isn't that your daughter?" The room shifted. My mother stared at the screen. My father leaned in. Eleanor crossed the room and looked at the post, and her expression moved through recognition, then surprise, then something that Grace described as delighted amusement. Eleanor confirmed what the post already said. Apex Events was one of the most successful event planning companies in the region, and she had signed a $2.1 million contract with its founder that very morning. The number landed in the room like a stone dropped in glass. My father went pale. $2 million exceeded his own company's annual profit. Eleanor had also read my Forbes profile. She mentioned this to the room. Grace was already searching it on her phone. The full article, my photograph, my office, the Denver skyline behind me. She read an excerpt aloud. I believe in showing up, not showing off. Guests were passing phones around, reading paragraphs to each other, looking at the photograph of me that had been published in a national magazine while my family had no idea it existed. Megan's face, by multiple accounts, went through several stages in quick succession. My mother stood frozen in the center of her carefully constructed Christmas, watching it disassemble around her. She asked, almost to herself, why Claire had never told them. Eleanor answered, with the precise gentleness of someone choosing words like surgical instruments, perhaps because you never asked. The silence that followed that sentence was, by all accounts, absolute. Grace Coleman, the same woman who had been at every Hartwell Christmas dinner for 15 years, who had watched me carry platters from the kitchen while my sister sat at the table, spoke up. She said she had always wondered about me, that I was always in the kitchen, always working, and my family barely mentioned me. She remembered the stuffed mushrooms I had made years ago and said she should have known that someone with that kind of talent would do something remarkable with it. My father's business partner, Harold, stepped forward and asked my father directly why he had never mentioned that his daughter ran a $4 million company. He said they could have done business together years ago. My father had no answer. Eleanor made the implications explicit before she left. She told my parents that the woman they had spent years treating as household help was the same woman she had just invested $2 million in. She said that, from where she was standing, it looked as though my family had expected me to prioritize dinner rolls over the single most significant contract of my professional career. She said she now understood why I hadn't mentioned the family connection. Then she set down her untouched wine glass, thanked my parents for the invitation, said the evening had been illuminating, and left. The front door clicked shut. The room erupted. In my apartment across town, I was eating pad thai and watching a film, entirely unaware that my family's social world was rearranging itself around the truth they had spent 15 years refusing to see. The professional fallout from the summit signing was immediate and unmistakable. Eleanor's LinkedIn post was shared thousands of times within 48 hours. My inbox filled with partnership inquiries from companies I had been trying to reach for years. An industry magazine requested an interview. 2 competing firms sent job offers, both of which I declined. By December 30th, Daniel had projected a 35% revenue increase for the coming year based on the summit contract alone. The social fallout in Denver was a different kind of cascade. Grace Coleman posted something on December 26th that didn't name anyone but that everyone in the relevant social circle understood immediately. An observation about never underestimating the people in your own family and about the most successful person in the room often being the one nobody notices. 287 people liked it. The comments included pointed questions about family dynamics and supporting our children. My mother's phone began ringing. Women from her charity committee, her book club, her garden society, all calling with thinly veiled curiosity. Why hadn't she ever mentioned that her daughter was so successful? They had assumed I was struggling. They had been told in various framings over many years something that had led them to that assumption. The image my mother had spent years cultivating, devoted wife, supportive mother, pillar of community, had developed cracks that no amount of composure could seal. My father's business partner, Harold, called on December 27th to ask for an introduction to Apex Events for an upcoming project launch. My father, who had never once introduced me to a professional contact who had spent 15 years treating my career as invisible, was now being asked to facilitate a meeting with his own daughter's company. Harold didn't wait. He found my business email and sent a formal inquiry that afternoon. I responded within 2 hours with a proposal. My father was no longer the gatekeeper. Megan's situation was the most complex to sit with. She had spent months positioning herself as the family's business ambassador to Summit Holdings, attending networking events, sending strategic emails, trying to set up meetings for our father's company. None of it had mattered. On December 28th, she contacted Eleanor's office directly requesting a follow-up conversation about potential partnership opportunities. Eleanor's assistant responded with a polite final message about directing future inquiries to the standard vendor application process. She had spent years being celebrated as the successful one. That identity had taken 3 days to collapse. I didn't feel joy at her pain, but I also won't claim I felt nothing. On December 29th, a handwritten letter arrived at my apartment by overnight delivery. My father's handwriting on the envelope. I almost didn't open it. He had spent the 4 days since Christmas trying to understand, he wrote, how he had missed what was right in front of him for 15 years. He said he had told himself he was a good father. He said the truth was that he had seen what he expected to see. He had expected Megan to succeed and looked for her successes, had expected me to struggle and found what he looked for. He said he was wrong. Deeply, terribly wrong. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, that he hadn't earned it, but that he wanted me to know he saw me now, that he was proud, belatedly, inadequately, but genuinely. I read it 3 times, set it on my kitchen counter, made coffee. A letter didn't undo 15 years. Words didn't erase actions. But it was something I hadn't had before. My mother sent a single text on New Year's Eve. Happy New Year. Hope you're well. Performative politeness over unresolved resentment. The kind of message that requires nothing and offers nothing. I read it, understood exactly what it was, and left it unanswered. She was not ready. I had given her 15 years of chances. She could have this one. What I did not do in the days that followed was monitor any of it. I did not refresh Grace's Facebook post to count the comments. I did not text mutual acquaintances to find out what people were saying. I did not call anyone in the Denver social circle that my mother had spent years cultivating. I had learned from 12 years of running a business that the best outcomes happen when you do the work correctly and then let it land without standing over it watching. The same principle applies to the truth. You tell it once, cleanly, and you walk away. Grace Coleman was the one who called me. December 26th, 2 days after Christmas, while I was back at my desk in Denver reviewing the Summit contract terms with Daniel. She told me she had known my family for 15 years and had never once asked what I actually did for a living. She said she was sorry for that. She said she wanted me to know that what Eleanor had said, that I was one of the most impressive young executives she had encountered, had been heard by every person in that room, that the community was not going to let my parents quietly move past it. And then, because Grace had always been sharper than she let on at Christmas parties, she said something that I wrote down and kept. It turns out the most successful person at your family's table for 15 years was the one carrying the platters. Harold Coleman's business inquiry arrived in my inbox that same day, a formal professional message asking about event planning for an upcoming project launch, the kind of message I received routinely from clients who had found us through referrals or industry press. Except this one came from a man who had been my father's business partner for 20 years, a man who had watched me carry platters and heard my mother say, "That's just Claire," and moved on to the next conversation without a second thought. Now he was writing to me with the careful respect you reserve for someone you consider a peer. I responded with a proposal within 2 hours. My father was not included in the introduction. He didn't need to be. I had spent 12 years building a company that did not require him as a gatekeeper, and it turned out that was exactly the right preparation for this moment. New Year's Eve, 2024. I stood at my apartment window watching fireworks go up over downtown Denver, the city lit and celebrating below me. My phone sat on the counter. I had set new rules for it. Muting group chats, declining calls I wasn't ready for, responding on my own timeline rather than theirs. The letter from my father was still on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. I had read it a dozen times over 2 days and felt something different each time. Anger, then sadness, then something cautious that might eventually become hope, then skepticism, then back around again. At 11:47, I picked up the phone and called him. He answered on the first ring. I could hear my mother's voice in the background asking who was calling. He didn't tell her. I told him I was willing to try to rebuild something, but not the way things had been. Not me in the kitchen, while the rest of the family sat at the table. Not my work being called a hobby while Megan's was called a career. Not me being invisible while she was introduced and showcased. I told him that if I came to family events, I came as a guest, as an equal, not a staff. That I needed him to ask about my life, my company, my clients, my goals, and to actually be interested in the answers. That I needed to be acknowledged as a member of this family rather than its unpaid service department. He said it was fair. He said it was more than fair. And then, his voice rougher than I had ever heard it, he said he should have been doing all of that from the beginning. The silence between us carried 15 years of things left unsaid, but for the first time, it didn't feel hostile, just exhausted. The particular exhaustion of two people who had been standing on opposite sides of something for so long that they had forgotten what it was like not to be. I told him I would come to dinner the following Sunday, that I would come as a guest, that someone else could cook. He could order from the Italian place he used to like when Megan and I were small. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and drafted a document that was not an email to my family, not a rant, not an accusation. It was a clear statement of terms, written in the same professional language I would use with any difficult client. I would attend family gatherings as a guest, not a servant. I would not accept disrespect wrapped in humor or casual dismissal. I would not apologize for prioritizing my career. I would be treated as an equal or I would not participate. I would respond to genuine connection and ignore manipulation. My time and energy had value. I would spend them accordingly. Simple rules, clear expectations, the kind of boundaries I should have established 15 years ago. But here is what I have learned. It is never too late. You are never too far in, never too conditioned, never too entrenched to change the pattern. The moment you decide you deserve better is the moment everything begins to shift. I saved the document, closed the laptop, and stood at the window for a while longer. The fireworks had slowed to occasional bursts, the big synchronized display finished, the crowd dispersing below, Denver settling into the first quiet hours of a new year. I thought about the phone call with my father, not the content of it. I had been over the content many times already, but the quality of the silence at the end. The particular kind of silence that happens when something true has been said and both people know it and neither one has a way to undo the years that led to the saying of it. That silence had weight, but it wasn't hostile. It felt more like the first morning after a long storm. The air different, the ground wet, the damage visible, but the worst of it over. I did not know what my mother would do with the information she now had. She had sent the 2-word text, and I had not responded, and we were both waiting in the particular way of people who have not yet decided how much further to go. Maybe she would come around. Maybe she would need months. Maybe she would call and say nothing useful. Maybe she would write something, the way my father had written something, and mean it. Or mean it as much as she was capable of meaning anything that cost her self-image. I genuinely did not know, and for the first time in 15 years of trying to predict and manage her reactions, I found that I did not need to know. What she did next was her work, not mine. Megan had sent nothing, not a text, not an email. The silence from her felt different from my mother's, less managed, more raw. I imagined her in my old room at my parents' house, which is where she had apparently been staying since the holiday. I imagined her sitting with the specific discomfort of someone whose identity has been reorganized without their permission. For years, being the successful daughter had been as much a part of her as any personality trait she would have claimed for herself. It was going to take time to figure out who she was without it as a foundation. That was not my problem to solve, but it was something I thought about, and not without some gentleness. I had built everything I had by doing the work when no one was watching and receiving no credit for it. That had been lonely and hard, and sometimes it had felt like shouting into a room where no one could hear you. What I understood now, standing at the window on New Year's Eve with a signed $2 million contract on my desk, was that the work had always been the point. The recognition was secondary. The recognition was what happened when the work was good enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. My family had finally run out of ways to ignore it. At midnight, the fireworks reached their peak over Denver, brilliant, overlapping, the whole city exhaling at once into a new year. Daniel texted, "Happy New Year, boss. 2025 is going to be incredible." I wrote back that he was right, that it already was. I thought about Eleanor Vance and what she had said to my parents before she left, that she now understood why I hadn't mentioned the family connection. That simple sentence had done more in 30 seconds than anything I had said in 15 years of careful, patient silence. Not because it came from me, because it came from someone my family actually respected. Someone with authority in the world they understood and valued. There is a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. They build a version of you early before you have had the chance to become yourself, and they maintain that version because updating it would require them to admit they were wrong. And some people find that admission more costly than the truth. So you stay small in their eyes. You stay the wallpaper. And after a while, you start to wonder if you really are as small as they see you, even when the evidence says otherwise. I had a Forbes article. I had 23 employees. I had a $4.2 million business. And I still went to my parents' house and picked up an apron because 15 years of being told that family comes first had wired something in me that took longer to unwire than I would have liked to admit. What finally unwired it was not a confrontation, not a speech, not a dramatic moment of telling them who I was. What unwired it was a $2.1 million meeting in Miami on Christmas Eve, and the simple act of choosing it over an apron. I didn't set out to teach them a lesson. I set out to sign a contract. The lesson arrived on its own, delivered by a woman who had read my Forbes profile and thought I was worth meeting. The same woman my parents had invited to Christmas dinner, expecting spectacular food, and found instead an empty kitchen and 2 rotisserie chickens from a grocery store. That is the specific kind of irony that cannot be manufactured. My parents are not villains. I want to be clear about that. They are people who made assumptions and never questioned them, who confused the daughter they expected with the daughter they had, and who paid a social price for that confusion in front of everyone whose opinion they valued. That is not nothing. It is, in its way, its own kind of reckoning. My mother is still not ready. That is her process. not mine, and I'm no longer waiting for her to complete it on my timeline. My father sent a letter. He is trying. Whether that trying becomes something real depends on choices he hasn't made yet. Megan is learning, I think, what it costs to have your scaffolding removed. I have some sympathy for that. Being the golden child is its own kind of trap. You never develop the muscle you need because someone is always holding you up. When the holding stops, you find out what you are made of, and that discovery is hard at any age. I hope she finds something solid underneath. I genuinely do. Grace Coleman called me on December 26th and apologized for 15 years of attending Hartwell Christmas dinners without once asking what I actually did. She said she had heard what Eleanor said about me, that I was one of the most impressive young executives she had met, and that everyone in the room had heard it. She said my family had a lot of explaining to do, and that the community was not likely to let them forget it anytime soon. She also said something nobody in my family had ever said to me directly in 15 years. She said I had clearly worked very hard, that I deserved every success. I sat with those words for a long time. They came from a near stranger, not from the people whose voices I had spent my whole life hoping to hear them from. And I realized, sitting with that waiting for the right person to say the right words had been the most expensive thing I had ever done. More expensive than anything on any contract I had ever signed. The month of January brought 3 new client meetings confirmed, 2 declined job offers, an interview request from an entrepreneurship publication, and a projected 35% revenue growth for the year ahead. Daniel summarized it on our first Monday call of the new year. Every late night, every difficult client, every sacrifice over 12 years. It had led to this. I believed him finally. On my desk, I keep 2 things: a framed copy of the Forbes article, the one I packed in my bag on the flight to Miami like armor, like proof, and a photograph taken at the signing. Eleanor Vance and me, hands clasped, Miami skyline glittering through the glass behind us, 2 women who had each built something from nothing, looking directly at the camera. There is a saying about success being the best response to dismissal. I used to think of it that way, as a response, as a correction, as proof directed at the people who doubted me. I don't think of it that way anymore. Thinking of it that way means you are still measuring your worth by their standards, still building your life as an argument addressed to them. What I built wasn't a response. It was a life. My life, made from the choices I made when nobody was watching, when nobody was celebrating, when nobody in the family room was asking how it was going. The apron is still hanging in my parents' kitchen. I will never wear it again. Not because I am punishing anyone, but because I finally understand that the person who cooked 15 years of dinners that were eaten without a thank you and forgotten before the dishes were done, that person is not who I am. I am the one who booked the flight to Miami. And that decision, made standing in a cold kitchen on December 23rd with flour on my hands and someone else's expectations tied around my waist, was the most important one I ever made. Your success doesn't require their acknowledgement. It doesn't require their approval. It only requires you to stop waiting for it and to choose yourself instead.